Okay, Alon, I think you're good.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our last Summer Lectures series event. And we have the distinguished guest, Ian Lustick, who is going to give us a talk entitled Annexation or No Annexation. Israel is the only state between the sea and the river. It comes from his new book, recently published, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, published by University of Pennsylvania Press, and it is available, among others, on the website bookshop.org. If you buy books there, some of the proceeds go to your local bookstore, which I think is a very important thing these days to support. This summer, we had a series of lectures about the past and about the present, about the Holocaust, about refugees, about the remembrance of COVID-19 while it is still going on. And we end with a present subject that is, I think, similarly or at the same time, simultaneously, it's a topic about the past and about the future, what will happen in the Holy Land. And there are few people in the US and in the world who are more knowledgeable and authoritative to speak about this than Ian Lustick, who is the best Heyman Chair in Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards. He has served as a consultant on Middle East, national security, and intelligence issues for each of every American administration since the 1970s, except the present one. He has published multiple books and articles in leading international journals related to Middle East politics in general and to the Arab-Israeli dispute in particular. His current research focuses on the origins and dynamics of the one-state reality in Israel-Palestine. It is a great honor and privilege to have Ian with us. Some housekeeping notes before we begin. The best way to view our talk is in a speaker mode. And I'd like you to know, that this talk is recorded. You can see there is an announcement on the top left-hand side of your screen. And it will be eventually put on our website. At the end of the talk, we are going to have a Q&A and comments. The way we are going to direct the traffic is, why don't you send me your questions, or if you want to make a comment. That is, Ian said that he is welcoming comments that are not simply questions, but perhaps oppositions, reflections, and others. So just write me and tell me that you want to talk or that you have a question, and I will then direct it to Ian. I remind you to like us on Facebook and to go to our website to see many other things that the Institute is doing. If by any chance you have a problem during the meeting, the best thing is to write Paz, who is the bearded guy, let's say the youngest guy, I think, and his email is ihgms@umass.edu, and he will be checking it throughout to see whether you have any problems, technical or otherwise. With this, I'd like to give the floor to Ian and to his talk. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you,
Alon. I really am delighted to be here and everywhere else that my voice is. And I very grateful for everyone checking in. This is the new normal. I had maybe 20 or 30 talks canceled as a result of COVID, but I've been doing quite a few of these, and I'm getting better at it. And I'm going to try today using a PowerPoint with some animated slides. So you'll be able to see me, I understand, but the main thing will be looking at these. And I should be, I'd say 30 minutes to 40 minutes, and then really hope to have an active and engaged discussion. I noticed that many people on this call who are friends of mine, I wish we could have personal individual conversations. Maybe later we can. I also want to mention, thank Shaul Magid, who wrote a very nice review of the book. With that, we'll start. So let me see if I can pull up my PowerPoint, and then the screen should be shared. Okay, can everyone see that? May pause?
No.
You can't, all right. So I've got to.
Try it again, click the little green.
Here we go. How's that?
Yeah, you're good, just press play.
Well, I got to get the, yeah, there it is, slideshow.
Yeah, you're all set.
Okay. So, annexation or no annexation, Israel is the only state between the sea and the river. The core idea in this book, Paradigm Lost, is a need for a fundamental change in the way we think about the Israel-Palestine question. And I know it's kind of cliche to say we need a fundamental way, a change in the way we think. And people can think that's a kind of fuzzy thing to say. It's not. In this case, at least, I mean something very specific. It means a really fundamental change in something that we're used to doing when we think. And to change that category that we think with means going below the assumptions and presumptions that are attached to some of our deepest beliefs. Those are capturing the term that you're probably familiar with, the idea of a paradigm, of a set of ideas and assumptions and categories that actually precede systematic thinking about an issue. They tell you what not to think about and what kinds of things to focus on when you are thinking about the issue. Its change in a paradigm is very difficult. There can be no rules within a paradigm for when you get rid of the one you have. And that makes the kind of thinking and the kind of challenge about thinking having to do with paradigm change a very distinctive operation. So we're going to start by looking at the title and the cover of the book, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. And you'll see there's this portrayal of the area between the river and the sea that is an unusual combination of a Palestinian keffiyeh, shaded not black and white, but kind of bluish and white, and a partial Jewish star spread over an area that's not really confined to any particular boundary line that you might be familiar with. We can ask ourselves, I want you to ask yourself, what is this thing between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea? What is it? What kind of thing is it? That question is an ontological question. Ontology is the study of existence. An ontological question is a question about what it is that actually exists before we try to talk about it. What kind of a thing is it that exists? It's technically a metaphysical question. It's a question that is prior to physics, prior to systematic consideration of a question. So when we ask, what is it, this thing between the river and the sea, we could say, what we typically say, what the standard paradigm has been, is it the state of Israel within the green line, plus territories that are actually not the state of Israel, that's a typo, plus territories that are not the state of Israel. So you could imagine, as we tend to traditionally, that there are two things between the river and the sea. There's this thing called Israel, and then there's these other territories that are not part of Israel, but they're between the river and the sea. Or is this thing between the river and the sea, is it the state of Israel? And there's nothing between the river and the sea that's not part of the state of Israel. What I am saying simply, and I'm going to be going into detail as to why and why it's important to look at it this way, is that the two-state solution paradigm requires and forces and leads you to view the situation west of the Jordan as one state and then territories that are not part of it. But if you switch and see it as one state which rules different populations in different territories somewhat differently, a lot of different things happen in your mind, and a lot of problems disappear, and other problems, I think better ones, come into view. So that's the ontological question. Now I'm going to go into just an example of what I mean by thinking ontologically and how big and dramatic a change it makes. Let's ask ourselves, what is fire? That's a simple question, or at least it seems like one. What is fire? Well, it actually depends on whether you operate within the Aristotelian paradigm, in which is how most of Europe, at least, thought about things up through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, and until the Enlightenment. You thought, well, the world is made up of four elements: water, earth, air, and fire. So if you, from an Aristotelian point of view, fire is a substance. It's a fundamental part of reality. It's like air, it's like water, it's like earth, and then there's this thing, fire. Now, from a point of view of this paradigm, why do things burn? Well, things burn because fire is in some things and not others in the form of phlogiston. Phlogiston is an invisible substance that is in wood, but not in things that don't burn. And when heat is applied to things that have phlogiston in them, the phlogiston leaves the thing that's being burned and appears as fire and is poured into the air. So the air becomes filled with this phlogiston. That's what this little picture shows: phlogisticated air as a result of phlogiston leaving the wood, and then you have ash behind with no phlogiston left. Now, Lavoisier and the 18th century invention of chemistry said, we can't figure out what's going on in the world, even though so much has been done up till now with this phlogiston theory. A whole industry of metallurgy worked, but there were some weird things that when you burned a piece of wood and you weighed what remained, it weighed more than it did before. In other words, the phlogiston leaving it didn't make the wood lighter. So this, among other anomalies, led Lavoisier and others to come up with a theory of combustion in which there was no such thing as phlogiston. Fire was not a thing like earth or air. It was the effect of gases and molecules, things called molecules, which nobody had ever seen before. And when they move around and become a plasma-like substance when heated in the presence, when gases are heated in the presence of oxygen. That's what fire is, a theory of combustion that completely did away with phlogiston. It took a long time. And before, combustion and oxygen took decades and decades to replace phlogiston theory. It's really a paradigm shift. And in my book, I go into other examples from Ptolemaic astronomy to relativity theory in order to illustrate how in a political project, such as should there be a two-state solution, or should there be democracy, should there be one state, what should happen, what will happen between Israelis and Palestinians, all of those questions which are political, the same kind of unstated assumptions, unquestioned assumptions that are present in analytic and scientific paradigms, they are also present in political programs. Whether you are in a community of scholars or a community of activists or a combination, you are in a community that has a project. You either want to learn about the world, you want to learn about it in order to be more effective in it, to be more effective in your explanations and your predictions, or in your policies that you're pursuing. You are a community that needs unquestioned assumptions. That allows you to focus. And my book is about what happens when the unquestioned assumptions about a project, namely the two-state solution project, are no longer valid, how that affects things and how people can overcome that and come to see the world differently. That's the sense in which Paradigm Lost is moving from a two-state solution paradigm, not to a one-state solution paradigm, but to a one-state reality. When I say a two-state solution, I mean that for 30 to 40 years, starting in 1969, when I was first in Israel and confronted the Palestinian problem, I adopted the position that there should be two states, and there could be two states, a Palestinian and Israeli state, next to each other. And I fought for that for decades, and I studied it. I studied it in Britain and France. I studied it from every conceivable angle. Went into the settlements, to land questions, Palestinian politics, Israeli politics. I was a key part, or tried to be a key part of that solution. When I say that it was a solution, I mean that it not only was a picture of the future that I preferred to the oppression of the present that I lived in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, but that I thought there was a way to get there, a reasonable way through negotiations, political change in Israel, smart foreign policy in the United States, educating both Palestinians and Israeli Jews to their actual long-run interests, and that some kind of a negotiating solution along these lines could have occurred. I now still think that there was a 20 to 30% possibility that that could have worked. If history could be replayed 1,000 times, we might get an Oslo-style agreement maybe 200 or 300 times, but that's no longer the case. And so I am no longer saying that although two states is a pretty picture of the future, since I don't know how to get there through a plan, I don't consider it a solution. And I don't consider a one state, however pretty that picture may be, whether it's made up of cantons or a confederal arrangement or a binational arrangement, however you portray it, it could be a pretty picture, but without a political program bringing you from here to there, I don't consider it a solution. Instead, what I'm saying is that what we have to work with from a paradigm point of view and from a political point of view is a reality that between the river and the sea, there is one state already. The question is not dividing it, but changing it, and whether and how that can be done. So I'm going to go into this in some detail because the costs of sticking with what is an old security blanket of the two-state solution paradigm, there are costs associated with it. There are intellectual and political costs. I think that people who are still working for a two-state solution when it's not possible are actually playing the sucker for a right wing that would prefer not to have any useful work to be done to change the situation. But I want to argue that if you are willing to do the somewhat painful work of switching your gestalt so that you really do see the thing between the river and the sea as one state and not Israel and then parts that aren't Israel, there are lots of opportunities that you will experience, lots of adaptive, new and exciting ways to think about political opportunities and questions to ask. You might be more anxious, but I guarantee you, you won't be as bored as you have been with the same old questions and the same answers to those questions that lead pretty much nowhere under the two-state solution paradigm. Now, in order to do that, I have to have to go over some ground that for many of you may already be passé, which is it the case that it's no longer possible to get a two-state solution and through negotiations? And I want to start by talking about settlements, but as you see, the settlements themselves are not the main problem. I want you to go back 39 years ago into the early 80s when Meron Ben-Venisti started warning that things in the West Bank and Gaza had gone so far that it was what he called 5 minutes to midnight. Midnight was the point at which it would be impossible to stop the momentum of the settlement project toward a situation where the Israeli political system would never produce a government capable of leaving the West Bank, and therefore the territories with their Palestinian population would be incorporated into Israel. That was 39 years ago that he said that, and that Tom Friedman wrote in the New York Times his op-ed titled 5 Minutes to Midnight. That was also half a dozen Likud governments ago and 500,000 settlers ago. Okay, there's Meron Ben-Venisti, October 1983. Within 36 months, there will be some 100,000 Jewish inhabitants of the West Bank. If this occurs, it will become impossible for any government of Israel to relinquish control. Israel's most savvy correspondents and journalists who were mainly responsible and practically living in the West Bank and Gaza agreed with him. Amos Alon, February 1983, for all practical purposes, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza have already been annexed to the state of Israel, perhaps irrevocably. Yehuda Litani of Haaretz, February 1983, within just 7 weeks, negotiating initiatives for a territorial compromise could be irrelevant. Donnie Rubenstein, there is no chance that Israel will be able to give up as much as 1 meter in the West Bank and Gaza, even if it wishes to. Shmuel Toledano, one of who was the Arab Affairs advisor and an important Labor Party politician in April 1982, within a few years, if anyone were to suggest giving up any part of the territories, it would be regarded as no different than that of giving up part of the Negev or the Galilee. Hirsch Goodman in the Jerusalem Post, for anyone who has spent even a little time on the West Bank recently, this is in August 1983, it must have become obvious that de facto annexation has taken place. An uncharacteristically energetic and efficient arm of the government's bureaucracy put into motion a process that in 6 years has created facts that any rational person must now concede are irreversible. And John Kerry, much later than that, 2013, still was saying the same kind of thing. I believe the window for a two-state solution is shutting, he said in 2013. I think we have some period of time, 1.5 to 2 years, or it's over. Now, there's something going on in which people can say something so long ago and keep saying it even though it's obviously incorrect for decades and decades. And that's what we are seeing with the two-state solution paradigm. When we look at the situation now in a map form, well, this is what we see. This is what I see. I do not see, look at the map on the left, where you have the green line in dots, the old demarcation of the armistice line, and you have Palestinian areas under the Oslo Accords, areas A and B, cut up into pieces by areas controlled by Israel, area C, and Israeli settlements. What you have is an archipelago of ghettos. Gaza is one big ghetto, but in the West Bank, what you have is inside of a state, all of these Palestinian ghettos with strict controls over movement into and outside of them. The map on the right is from the Trump-Kushner plan. I may be one of the only people in the world to actually read all 70 pages of it, and we can talk about it. I've published an article about it. But here you see, although you don't really see it, because if you look at those little circles pasted onto the map of the archipelago of ghettos, which they are willing to allow Israel, if Israel is willing to do so, after the Palestinians have become Finland, that Israel is going to supposedly allow the Palestinians to call this a state, those circles are covering crossing points which show that they're actually separated from one another. So you have a collection of ghettos with the wall rebuilt so that it surrounds each of them, so that they literally are enclosed ghettos. It's already more or less like that. And to me, even talking about Gaza, I don't know if any of you watch Fauda. I watch Fauda, and right now it's all about this hair-raising adventures of the unit in Gaza, which to them is like Mars, but as if it's a different country. But it really isn't a different country. It's a part of Israel that's ruled differently than other parts of Israel. And it's often said that Gaza is a big prison. It has 2 million people in it. It's completely surrounded by Israel, virtually. Mail delivered by Israel, taxes collected by Israel. No one's property is safe. No one's property really is property unless the Israeli state agrees that it should continue to remain undestroyed. My book goes into an analysis of Gaza from the point of view of what political scientists treat as a state. But I want to point out one thing. There are plenty of prisons inside of Israel filled with Palestinians. Israel does not control what goes on in the prison yards. The prisoner organizations, Hamas, Fatah, the PDFLP, the PFLP, they control what goes on inside the prison yards. But that does not mean that those prisons are not in Israel. Israel works with those prisoner organizations. The same thing is true in Gaza. Hamas is operating, in effect, as a prisoner organization, protecting the borders of Israel from the extremists, quote unquote, in Gaza. If you want to ask me, and I'll say something that might be considered somewhat controversial, and it's not that I don't respect people in the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority now has become the functional equivalent of the Arab departments of Israeli ministries. The Palestinian Authority is fundamentally Israel's Arab department for Judea and Samaria. So the biggest problem that Palestinians face because the Palestinian Authority starts to reduce its ties with the state of Israel is they have nowhere to submit their bureaucratic applications. Normally you go, if you're an Arab, you go to the Arab department of the ministry and submit your application for this or that. If you're in the West Bank, you go to the Palestinian Authority and it forwards your application to Israel. Now there's nowhere to go with your application. That's what I mean by the reality is that it's not a separate area waiting to be a state. It's part of the Israeli state, ruled in a different way than other parts. Now let's go to the next slide. There's a distinction that Wittgenstein makes between ordinary language and grammar. Grammar is what you say officially when you're trying to speak nicely and properly. It's what countries put in their laws. It's what countries say officially. Ordinary language is what you naturally believe, how you naturally see the world when you're not trying to speak correctly. If you look at the maps that Israel uses for all different purposes, you can start to see how from a normal, everyday, ordinary language point of view, the country is between the river and the sea is all Israel, just ruled in somewhat different ways. On the left, you have maps of the regions of Israel. And you can see that the West Bank and Gaza are brown. They're not officially called yet natural regions, but they're still integrated in the same color scheme. When you have a map of internal migration, where Israelis are moving from one region to another, as in this second map, you can see that one of the regions they move in and out of is Judea and Samaria, just like any other region. When the Israeli census counts how many people there are in the country, they don't say there are 8 million, 14 million people, or excuse me, 14 million people between the river and the sea. They don't say there are 7 million or 8 million people inside of Israel, and then we subtract the 600,000 who live in the West Bank. No, the Israelis who live in the West Bank settlements are counted just the same as if they're living in Israel. The weather forecast makes no distinctions between Gaza, the West Bank, the rest of the country. And if you look closely at the topography of Israel map, and you try at any map, you'll see the line that surrounds Gaza. You'll see there barely is a line that surrounds the West Bank, but the line that surrounds Gaza is, if you look closely at it, it is not an international border. It is a border between something called the Gaza region or the Gaza enclave and Israel, but to my mind is simply a part of Israel ruled differently. If you look at hiking or Ministry of Tourism maps, again, the ordinary language of Israeli ministries, you see no or trivial differences between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And on the right side, you see very faintly, you can see the outlines of Area A and the West Bank, and the Gaza region is painted differently. But the border between Israel and those regions is not an international border. It's not even recognized as any particular border between Israel and another country. So that's in the ordinary language of politics or the ordinary of life. Now, this is a passage from my book. It's kind of amusing, and that's why I am sharing it with you. It's not just the idea that two states, that negotiating a two-state solution is any longer possible. Even being able to talk about it has died. It's not that just that the idea has died, the metaphor for it dying has died. It's come to be beaten to death by overuse. The idea that the settlements and other things that I'll talk about have destroyed the possibility of a two-side solution has been described in every conceivable way as a process of death. But it's taken so long that it reminds me of the Saturday Night Live routine when Francisco Franco was in a coma for what it seemed like years. And every Saturday night for a while, the weekend update would say, Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still not dead. And that is more or less what we have with the two-state solution. Let me read this quickly. Since the Second Intifada, a question and a metaphor have come to dominate public discussion of the two-state solution. The question that hangs above its advocates like a sword of Damocles is whether de facto annexation has rendered the project impossible or so implausible that the entire paradigm of separating the West Bank from Israel as the route to peace must be abandoned. The prevailing metaphor is death. Has the two-state solution died? Is it on life support? Is it dying but not dead? Or is it dead but not buried? Or is it dead as a dodo? Did the United States give the two-state solution the kiss of death when it recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Or was that act its death knell? There is no doubt that the two-state solution is definitely in trouble, if not on its deathbed. Or is it in a death spiral? Should it be allowed to die a natural death? Is it dead, or is it long dead and decomposing? Or perhaps it should be considered almost completely dead and closer to death every day. Is it in trouble but not dead? Did the two-state solution die, or was it put to death? Can we see signs of life, or only the reflexive twitching a dead body can sometimes exhibit? Should we say it isn't dead, but it is dying, that it is stuck but not dead? If it is dying, perhaps the two-state solution can be rescued and resuscitated. A major 2013 symposium in the Jewish periodical Moment magazine was titled, Is the Two-State Solution Dead? Instructively, 4 years later, the New York Times published a long article with the same title and effectively the same analysis. In fact, after the book came out, the New York Times published another editorial arguing the same thing. Now, how long does it take before something that is dead can be treated that way analytically? Okay, I've talked about the settlements, but I said earlier that they are just the tip of the iceberg. The question, what determines whether there can be a two-state solution or not as a negotiated outcome, is not whether Shaul Arieli or anyone else can draw lines which preserve some kind of transportational continuity among Palestinians surrounded by settlements. That's not the question. The question is, what kind of a country did Israel become so that you could now have 650,000 settlers over the Green Line, living in 1 out of 11 Israeli Jews lives over the Green Line. So what I'm arguing here is that Israel has changed. Much of the book is about this transformation that produced an Israel that is incapable of yielding a government that could negotiate a two-state solution and implement it, even if it was willing to risk what I, in 1990s, believed was necessary to risk, which is civil war. Even that is, you can't get a government that would even think it wanted to take that risk, let alone take the risk if it thought it could get something by it. So Israel was originally what we in the United States might call a blue state. It was a socialist state in many respects, and it was pragmatic. It became a purple state. That's supposed to be purple Ohio, but it is now, in American parlance, a deeply red state. There is virtually no Jewish organized left in Israel. The center of gravity politically has gone so far to the right that the governments that are formed, whether it would have been formed by Benny Gantz or Netanyahu, start from a position that offers the Palestinians absolutely nothing that any Palestinian could ever accept as a negotiated outcome. And that's true for every one of the people who led Blue and White, not just Benny Gantz. And they are considered centrists now. It's also so interesting, and we'll get to this later, that Israeli politics has moved so far to the right that to make it at all interesting, journalists have to treat Arabs as if they are part of the political system, so that it looks like there's a left bloc. In fact, there is a left centrist bloc if certain changes take place so that Israeli Arabs in Israel can be kosher parts of a coalition. And we're going to be talking about that later. But when I say that there's been this kind of transformation, the first 3 chapters of the book are looking at de facto annexation, at Holocaustia, and at the Israel lobby. What the book is saying is that no Israeli, whether it was Begin or Shamir or Peres or Dayan, nobody planned what we have now as the outcome. No one wanted what we have. What we have now is an unanticipated outcome, an unintended outcome. It is the result of not of designs or of architectures or of agreements. It's not anything the Palestinians wanted either. It's the result of the unintended consequences of partially successful or overly successful projects. De facto annexation, for example, is in part, as I explain in the book, the result of an iron wall theory that was adopted by Ben-Gurion from Jabotinsky. It said we must beat the Arabs repeatedly because we have nothing to offer them that they would accept, or that we would accept if they were them. But if we beat them seriously enough and often enough, they will agree to accept us as a reality, and then we can negotiate with them. So we don't blame them for attacking us. We expect it. We would do the same if we were them. They're the natives of this land, as Jabotinsky said. That's how natives behave. But we must always hold out the possibility that in the end, after they learn we can't be destroyed, that we can negotiate with them. That was how Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion talked about Arabs. They were normal people. Eventually, normal people will settle for what they can get. What Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion missed is that Jews are also normal. And when a people doesn't lose repeatedly, but when a group wins repeatedly, as the Jews did under the Iron Wall strategy, repeatedly defeating Arabs at relatively low cost, not always very low, but lower cost, it expanded the minimal requirements in the political project of Zionism. So it's true that the Arabs gradually reduced their demands on Israel, but Israel increased what seemed reasonable, natural, and right to Israelis. That was the unintended consequence of the partial success of the Iron Wall strategy, which led to territorial expansion and the settlements and the unintended consequences of those, which then became intended, of course, by the right-wing governments that took power in 1977, began taking power in 1977. Holocaustia is my term for one of the ways that Israelis remember the Holocaust, and Jews in general. It doesn't mean that one of the things I go into in detail is that in the early years, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there were 4 different ways for Israel to look at the Holocaust. And I don't want to go into all of them now. One of them was, it was a proof of the truth of Zionism, that if you were Zionist, you knew you had to get out of Europe and you had to fight, and the ones that weren't Zionists didn't know that, and they died as a result. A very simple kind of proof text for the truth of Zionism. Another way to look at the Holocaust was as a human rights, a crime against humanity, and an object lesson in human rights, which is what the Nuremberg trials said, and from time to time what Israeli educators said, and what they said in part during the Eichmann trial. There's another theme that the Holocaust was mainly a wasting asset. It was guilt by the Gentiles. It would soon go away. So in the meantime, while the Gentiles still felt guilty, Israel should get reparations from Germany. That was an important way to look at the Holocaust, in which Israel was partly the inheritor of the victims of the Holocaust. But the way of remembering the Holocaust that became hegemonic after Begin came to power was Holocaustia, the idea that Netanyahu uses all the time, that the only thing you really need to know about what it means to be Jewish is the Holocaust, and that it's always 1938, and the Goyim are always ready to turn into Nazis. Once you believe those things, and once you know that that's the truth, that is what remembering the Holocaust means. That is the Holocaust. And I go into quite a bit of detail about how Israeli political culture makes it so difficult to trust non-Jews. In my view, it's amazing how forthcoming at least some Israelis and some Israeli political parties, and even some governments, were to the idea of compromising with Palestinians when they have to stand up against that kind of cultural trope, which makes everything look as if it's a threat of extinction. The third, the Israel lobby factor, again, is an unintended consequence. And here I'm just telling you my analysis of this in this chapter on one foot, as it were, that the Israel lobby was established in order, partly by American Jews, not only Jews, to make sure that they didn't feel guilty about what happened in the Holocaust, that this time they really are going to protect Jewish interests. They never set up the lobby in order to bring right-wing governments to power that would expand the territory of the state and make peace impossible. There may have been, and there came to be, many donors to the lobby, to AIPAC, for example, who believed that. Sheldon Adelson is one of them, but that's not why the lobby came into power. But that's the effect it had in the context of American politics. American politics is organized in a way, as George Washington recognized early on, so that any group that had a passionate attachment or hatred to a foreign country could have an outsized influence on domestic politics because there would be no counterweight to it. If you think about 2 issues, Israel and what other issue does the United States treat over the decades in a way that are 3 to 4 standard deviations from the international norm, completely different than the rest of the world. There are 2 such issues in foreign policy. One is Israel, where you commonly get 140 votes to 2 or 140 votes to 1, up to 3. The other issue is Cuba, where the United States and Israel are the 2 states in the world that still vote to, or have still voted to embargo Cuba, to boycott Cuba. What accounts for the fact that these 2 issues that are completely different are the 2 issues that the United States stands in opposition to the entire world? What they have in common is that they each have small but extremely potent domestic lobbies. One focused in Florida, one the Cuban lobby, and others a little bit more spread out across the country. That's what they have in common. That shows the dynamics of American politics, so that every president, and I show this in my chapter, no matter what they think ought to be done or could be done, can't do it rationally because politically it's just not worth paying the price. And that's not something that's going to go away. That can change in other ways, but that fact is not going to go away. So the unintended consequences attached with each of these three things is what produced Israel as such a deeply red state that a two-state solution is no longer accessible. We go to the next slide. Now, I want to turn toward the question that has been on a lot of people's minds for the last 5 months, and that is annexation. To me, this is a bogeyman. It's a brouhaha. It's not really a serious fight. It's not that it's unimportant. I want it now to explain why, in what sense, the struggle over annexation that J Street and so many others have taken on as if it's the end of the world and they have to beat this or else. In what sense is it important? In what sense isn't it? Well, if annexation means permanent incorporation, well, it's already occurred. It's already occurred. De facto annexation has already occurred. That's, as we saw back in 1982-83, it was almost there. If you waited till the 2000s, it certainly was. There's no, by permanent incorporation, I mean no government capable of coming to power in Israel. In fact, no one is now capable of telling a story about how such a government could come to power, capable of negotiating a two-state solution that the Palestinians would accept. Now, if annexation means that Israelis living in the West Bank are living under Israeli law, it also has already occurred because the standard formula, whenever the Knesset passes a law, is that Israelis living in Judea and Samaria are to be treated under this law as if they are living in Israel. So in almost every way, even applying Israeli law won't really change how Israelis live in Judea and Samaria. If annexation is referred to as annexation or sovereignty, but is actually only the extension of the Israeli administration, law, and jurisdiction, which is the phrase that you find Netanyahu and others using sometimes. That is, if they say it's annexation, but really it's only the extension of administration, law, and jurisdiction to some zones, then it's what it really is not anything new. It's just a new description of an apartheid situation, a situation in which one state rules different kinds of people in vastly different ways. But it makes the apartheid a little less silent because you are now claiming in some way that some of the people in some areas who are not Jews are under Israeli law, and yet they're still not being treated equal to the others who are Israeli citizens. One reason why it is unlikely, that is why annexation of any kind is unlikely to be implemented by the Likud government in anything more than a decorative way, is precisely that once you even use the word annexation, it has the potential of opening up a much more productive struggle by Jews and Palestinians for equal rights, for democracy, for mutual rights. What do you mean? If we're annexed, then we should have equal rights to non-exclusivist self-determination. Those are the values that brought me to the two-state solution originally, that I want equal rights, I want democracy, and I want mutual rights to non-exclusivist self-determination for Jews and Arabs. If I can't get that from a two-state solution, I want to find out how else I can get those values. And once you start talking about real annexation and admitting that incorporation is permanent, you can then start to struggle for those values in other ways besides trying to get a Palestinian state established next to Israel. Let's do an even deeper dive. Though some of you may recognize that phrase, Israeli law, jurisdiction, and administration. It's not used as frequently as annexation or as sovereignty by Netanyahu. It's a quieter, but it's the more precise thing about what they actually would do if they did something. And we can learn a lot about what it means because it was done in 1967 in the area that Israel described as East Jerusalem. If you look at this map, you'll see a red line. You'll see, and that red line is the boundary drawn in the West Bank of an area about 71 square kilometers that in June 1967, Israel declared this area would be part of the municipality of West Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim. The law was a very strange combination of laws were passed and orders issued so that the state of Israel did not annex East Jerusalem or the expanded area around East Jerusalem. It instead expanded the municipal boundary in order to prevent Arabs from claiming citizenship, from being citizens, in order to prevent Jordan from taking Israel to the International Court, and in order to be able to permanently incorporate this area without saying that you annexed it. Let the rest of the world say that Israel had sovereignty in East Jerusalem and annexed it, as Trump has. That doesn't, Israel never has to say it. And in not saying it, you can exclude, at that time, 65,000 Arabs from voting rights and citizenship. There are now 350,000 Arabs in that area who also are still, with almost all of them, without Israeli citizenship, ineligible to vote in Israeli elections. The phrase that Israel used was that through its administrative procedures, it imposed Israeli law, jurisdiction, and administration in these areas. The Supreme Court of Israel did not recognize that as annexation or as expansion of the state of Israel. That's an involved legal argument, which I've written articles about if you're interested in the details. Now let's go to the next slide. Now you can say, wait a minute, Ian, in 1980, there was the law, the Jerusalem law, that annexed Israel, made it Jerusalem's capital. Yes, there was such a law, but it did not annex and did not use the word sovereignty, did not use the word sipuach, annexation, or ribonut. It actually had almost nothing in it that was operative. It did not change anything that happened in 1967. Here you have the texts of those laws, and you can search as long as you would like into the basic law of Jerusalem. You will not find the word sovereignty or annexation, even though most Israelis believe that Israel imposed sovereignty and annexed East Jerusalem. It did annex it from the point of view of permanent incorporation, of making it removed from negotiations, but it did not actually formally annex it, and that's how hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been deprived of political rights, and while the moderate camp in Israel has been deprived of their political support by the facade of full annexation, by the act of it physically, but legally not doing it. Excuse me. Now, what are the payoffs to what I call the gestalt shift to the one-state reality paradigm? It's painful, it's scary to give up our old ways of looking at the West Bank and Gaza as the potential negotiated state of the Palestinians, in which Israel will have a small Arab minority, but it'll still be a Jewish state, and we can still front it at least as a democracy, even though Jews and Arabs aren't exactly equal. But the Palestinians will have their state, they can bring their refugees to it, they'll have part of Jerusalem, and we can forget about this and get on with the Zionist dream that we may have all cherished since we were young. We know there are costs to giving that up. What are the payoffs to the shift to a one-state reality paradigm? Well, one is that you can give up a lot of the anxiety and anger and discouragement that are now part of your life if you're tied to the two-state solution. For example, oh my goodness, Trump has recognized a united Jerusalem. That's terrible. It will make it impossible for the Palestinians to have their capital there. Well, guess what? That's been impossible for a long time. The fact that you can treat the whole city and even the expanded area as united means that in the future, all the people, Arabs and Jews living between the river and the sea, will have access to all the city. So that is actually a good thing. So if you look at it as one state, then uniting Jerusalem is actually a good thing and not a bad thing. It also means that you could have democratic political rule in Jerusalem. If the Arabs there, they're citizens of the city, they have the right to vote in Jerusalem elections. They haven't voted in Jerusalem elections because the PLO and the Palestinian Authority tell them don't. We want to not recognize the occupation as permanent. But by not recognizing the occupation as permanent and forcing Arabs in East Jerusalem to be quiescent politically, the extreme right continues to dominate Jerusalem. The last election, an extreme right-wing mayor won with just 3,000 votes over a very reasonable guy who would have been elected if even half of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem who said they wanted to vote did vote, but they were pressured not to by Israel and by the PA. That idea that a democratic, moderate coalition could form in Jerusalem and set a precedent for the whole country, that's very exciting, and it's something to work for. We could worry about, oh my goodness, the end of the PA is going to collapse if Israel doesn't start negotiating, if Israel doesn't do this or that. To me, the end of the PA is not a bad thing. The PA leadership, even friends of mine in it, acknowledge that they are completely wedded to a two-state solution, even though they really don't believe it's possible anymore. In order to move forward, you have to end the PA, just as you would have to end the Arab departments in different ministries in order to make Israel a fully equal place. It may mean a reoccupation, but that will bring the oppression that exists at the hands of Israel over a non-Jewish population more visible and more targetable by political mobilization. It means, if you have a one-state reality paradigm, that you don't continue to worry, oh my goodness, they are building settlements in E1, the last place. If they build in E1, they'll never be able to have a Palestinian state. Hello. There already is not the possibility of negotiating the establishment of a Palestinian state. So don't let the right-wing governments squeeze things out of you, out of the United States, or give permission to do other things because they're not building in E1. It's a false, phony issue. And the more, you can also say to yourself, the more Jews settle in the West Bank, the more land there is for Arabs to live in inside of the Galilee, around Gaza, and elsewhere. So it's not, if you see it as one country, you don't worry so much about new settlements. The demographic argument. People like me, and I'm guilty of this as many others have, we used the demographic argument because we knew that most Israelis weren't like us. They didn't feel that comfortable living with Arabs. So we would say, you don't want to keep the West Bank and Gaza. They're filled with these Arabs. You feel uncomfortable being with Arabs. So let's get rid of the West Bank and Gaza. Let them have their state. Them there, us here, as Barak said. This is uncomfortable. It's a racist argument. To make the argument when it was possible to get a Palestinian state, that's an argument which you can say, well, the end justifies the mean. I'm going to use a nasty argument to get something positive. But once you say to yourself, there is no possibility of getting a two-state solution, if you continue to make the demographic argument, to tell Jews that they shouldn't want to live with Arabs, that Arabs are suspicious, they're scary, they're threatening, they're anti-democratic, that just carries the water for the right that doesn't want Arab votes to count in the determination of kosher governments in Israel. It would be the same as a racist argument in the United States trying to say that any government, any political party that relied on black votes would be illegitimate because we shouldn't have these blacks in the country. This doing away with the demographic argument is a crucial and natural step for progressives once they accept the one-state reality. Otherwise, they have to live with making an argument they're very uncomfortable with, and they deep down know is racist. We also can stop worrying about whether they're going to be US-sponsored peace negotiations and whether they'll be run correctly. The answer is yes, unfortunately, there will be peace negotiations because the United States, any president gets more out of having negotiations, even if they don't succeed, than not having them, because it's possible to pose as working closely with Israel toward peace. But we should not want the Biden administration, God willing, it should be the Biden administration, to sponsor new peace negotiations because they will just postpone the point at which the real issues are brought to the table. And those real issues are equality and non-discrimination. That's what the United States should be focused on. We shouldn't be wanting another John Kerry to plunge again into the kind of activity that a series of high-powered American lawyers have undertaken over the years, each one thinking that the only reason the Israeli-Palestinian problem has not been solved is because I have not been put in charge of solving it. But once I do, I'll be able to take care of it. That has got to stop. I'm not so sure it will stop, but my book was written in part to try to convince people that they shouldn't be yearning for US-sponsored negotiations to broker a deal between Israelis and Palestinians, that is counterproductive. End the occupation, yes, but ending the occupation, it does not necessarily mean Israeli withdrawal. The United States Union, the North, in the Civil War occupied the Confederacy. They were occupied territories, they were occupied states. Eventually the occupation was ended, perhaps too early, but it wasn't ended by the North withdrawing, it was ended by the incorporation of the South into the country. That is another way to end occupation, by full incorporation legally, so that whether you live in Nablus, whether you live in Ofra, or whether you live in Tel Aviv, you have the same rights no matter if you're Jewish or Arab. That is the kind of end of the occupation that we can and should be struggling for, but we are so trapped in the idea that ending the occupation means withdrawal that we're paralyzed, because withdrawal is not possible. It also means, finally, that when you think about this problem, the models that you use to think about it with change. Instead of thinking about the French withdrawing from Algeria, and I wrote a couple books about this, I just no longer think that that model is appropriate. When you think about it, you think about negotiations between the French and the Muslims, and that leads you to think about negotiations between Jews and Arabs, between Israelis and Palestinians, leading to an agreement about the future. That is not the way most extended, protracted, ethno-political, national conflicts end. Not through negotiation, but through political evolution toward a never anticipated outcome. So that we don't have the progress we have made, and it is some progress, between blacks and whites in the United States, did not come about because black leaders sat down with white leaders and they agreed on something. It happened because of political struggles by blacks, by whites, within the white community, splits, and that's how some alliances between whites and blacks occurred, developed, and now we have a Democratic Party that was the party of Jim Crow and now produces the first black president and can't win any elections without a massive black turnout. There was never any agreement to do that. Political evolution is how that happens. That's what democracy does. We can look at women also. How did women get the vote in the industrialized democracies? It took a long time. It took decades. It took generations. That is also a difference. The one-state reality paradigm says you are not going to be looking at the solution to this problem in your lifetime. It's not going to be months and years that your political calculations are in. It's decades and generations. The same kind of thinking that brought eventually freedom and democracy to the Irish Catholics, who were annexed to Britain in 1800, and to women. The men and the women didn't sit down across the table and negotiate in France or in Britain or in the United States that females should have the vote. There was political mobilization by women, some men who thought we're going to lose this election unless we get women to vote for us. That means women have to vote, and that created political incentives to extend the franchise and extend effective citizenship. The model is even that of Palestinian Arabs of 48, and this is not well understood. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you go back to 1948, look at this article right down here. A new stage was reached when on September 3rd, 1948, Western Galilee was declared occupied territory to which the laws of Israel applied. What happened after 48 is Israel went and expanded its control of areas that the UN had not allotted to the Jewish state. The Western Galilee was one of them, the Central Galilee, the Southern Negev. These areas were termed by the press and the government occupied territories. They were filled with Arabs, the Arabs that had not fled. How did they stop being called occupied territories? How did the occupation end? It ended because they were annexed, because these areas were absorbed by Israel, and it was a slow process. There actually was no declaration of annexation. there was first the use of the term occupied territories. Then in September 48, Israeli law and administration was applied, and Ben-Gurion made a decision to allow Arabs to vote because he was convinced that the Labor Party, using the military government that ruled the occupied Arab areas, would be able to funnel Arab votes to the Labor Party. And that is what happened. So, in other words, there was a political process. In 1950, there was the nationality law finally granted citizenship opportunities to all the people who lived in these territories. But there never was a formal declaration of sovereignty or of annexation, but a series of laws and political decisions that took quite a bit of struggle. The military government was not ended in the Arab areas until 1966. So this is the kind of process that we're looking forward to, that I'm looking forward to, when it comes to the other areas that Israel has ruled, not for 73 years, but for 53 years, namely the West Bank and Gaza. Now, getting to the last slides. What is important about the issue of annexation? It is important because the struggle for ending the occupation by withdrawal is over. But as I've stressed, the struggle to end occupation by full absorption and integration is only beginning. And I actually favor annexation. I favor using the word so that this struggle to turn annexation into full equality can begin. If it, whatever it is, this annexation is implemented and accepted by the world as annexation, if Netanyahu imposes Israeli law for Israeli citizens but doesn't change anything for non-Israelis, and the world accepts that, oh my goodness, annexation has taken place, then the world will have given up an opportunity to use annexation to struggle for democracy and equal rights, because it really will not have been applied. We should say that Israeli sovereignty and annexation has not been legitimately applied until democracy and equal rights are available to all, so that there really is no line on the map between part of the country where if you're born an Arab, you're a citizen, and part of the country where if you're born an Arab, you're not a citizen. That line has to disappear. Otherwise, it's apartheid under a new name. Another danger, and a reason why the issue of annexation is important, is if annexation does not happen, and it may not. Netanyahu is not in a rush to do something which is very controversial for Trump. If it does not happen, you will see two-state diehards declare, breathe a sigh of relief and declare a Pyrrhic victory because of our mobilization. The Democrats have stopped annexation, and they'll have a new lease on life to struggle for yet another round of hopeless negotiations. So it's even part of the problem is that this struggle to stop Israel from saying the word annexation is itself going to foster a continuation of a counterproductive struggle. If it does happen, those same two-staters, caught in a paradigm that paralyzes thinking within a web of emotional and political ties that incentivize the pretense of real negotiations over substance, they'll point out, well, it's not real annexation. Israel only did it to these areas, and they didn't actually use the word annexation, so we can continue struggle for two states. For many leaders and activists, Israeli, Palestinian, American, European, Max Planck, the famous German physicist, his law is likely to apply. This is the paraphrase of what he said. Physics progresses, funeral by funeral. Many people cannot change their paradigmatic way of thinking, no matter how much evidence they look for, but time has a way eventually of taking care of that problem. Now, there are two epigrams in my book, and this is the last slide. One of them comes from Leonard Cohen. Sounded like the truth, seemed a better way. Sounded like the truth, but it's not the truth today. And the other one, my grandfather used to say, man plans and God laughs. And just as the problems we have today were mainly the product of unintended consequences, no design solution will be implemented. Those unintended consequences, those intricate, complex, changing alliances will both within Israel and internationally, via politics, produce an inclusive outcome that features better problems than we have today. Not no problems, but better ones. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. This was a lot to think about. Very good. And we have some questions. And please direct more questions to me. So one question is, any ideas how to limit the United States support of Israel, and also how to limit it without getting Congress to vote for conditioning aid upon settlement growth? And a related question of the same person is, how can we start a process by which Palestinians will get back some of the land and water and other resources that were stolen from them? They should get it back. Israelis should give it back. Any ideas? How can we mount such a campaign or begin such a process to give it back? So these two questions.
Okay, thank you. One of the interesting things about the word occupation in American parlance is it doesn't really ring a bell for most Americans. When most Americans think about the occupation, they don't think about the West Bank. They think about Germany and Japan. The United States occupied Japan, we occupied Germany, and those were good things. And yeah, we ended them after we made them correct. After we got rid of Nazism, we got rid of militarism in Japan, then we ended the occupation. But those were good things. So one of the things that we can take advantage of is that we can continue to talk about ending the occupation, but what it really means is not withdrawal, but equality. Americans do respond to the idea of ethnic or racial discrimination, to national discrimination. They object to being taxed and being ruled with no voice. There are now, according to the Israeli military, more Arabs living between the river and the sea than there are Jews. So it's not even even if all Jews voted the same way, which they never will, it's not as if you can say that there's a democratic situation there. So one key answer to the question is you have to switch the slogans, that really the focus should be on equality and non-discrimination. Now that means something very interesting to me, something I'm still getting used to. As a good two-stater, I boycotted Ariel, where there's a university, a so-called university that was set up, and it's on expropriated Arab land. I don't think it's any longer legitimate for me to boycott that university while I don't boycott Tel Aviv University, which is established on an expropriated Arab land, on Sheikh Mohannes, a village. The question, and in fact, Ariel is very active in attracting Arab students. It's got a good record on that basis. So one of the things that I would argue is that Americans should start to say, well, where in Israel is there discrimination? Where is there exploitation? Is it in the West Bank? Is it in the Galilee? Maybe there are some settlements, and there are, where workers are treated very well, where the land has been acquired legally or fairly. So the real question should be mobilize against discrimination. Don't push the Biden administration toward negotiations. Instead, push towards speaking truth, because when you're in negotiations, you think you are, you don't want to speak publicly because the Israelis will say you're endangering the negotiations. So one of the things is just by speaking truthfully, voting at the UN the way we would really like to vote by our values. And the question of aid, that's something that actually Israelis for a long time have themselves become uncomfortable with how much aid the United States gives Israel from an economic point of view. But I wouldn't make that the primary focus. I'd start by focusing on what we're after. We're not after a two states. We're after, well, whatever the Israelis and Palestinians could come up with, but we don't think they're going to come up with anything. In the current one state reality, we want all people to have equal rights. And that's what we should focus on. And that's what the banner should be in the United States. I think the EU has to also be brought along with this. The EU leaders are in the same situation as American presidents. It's very comfortable for them to keep talking about a two-state solution even when they don't believe it's possible, because they don't run into the buzzsaws that they do on either side if they move away from that accepted conventional wisdom.
Thank you, Ian. We have many more questions, so let's move ahead. There is a question that raises the issue of the Palestinian voice. Isn't it somewhat of a chutzpah for you/us to advocate annexation or /one state when the Palestinians have not adopted such a platform?
Yes, you can say it's chutzpahdik, but that's my whole life. I've plunged into this at the beginning. I don't care about that. But it's also the fact, as I was saying, that Palestinians, more and more of them do want this. The Palestinian Authority is about as popular and trusted as the U.S. Republicans in the Congress by American people. It's considered corrupt. They don't want it. The reason why you had polls that showed that half of Arabs in East Jerusalem wanted to vote, and yet only a few thousand voted. Why? Because of intimidation by the PA. And by Israel. So if you talk to Palestinians, refugees or others, as I have, yes, they are very open to this. In fact, right now, polls would show, if not equal, more Palestinians would favor moving toward fighting for a one state where they would be able to live anywhere between the river and the sea than what's obviously a set of ghettos that is meant for them as two states. So just if you want to really know what Palestinians think, you have to give them the opportunity to say that. Even Heyman Chair, some of you may say, well, wait a minute, the joint list, the great white hope, as it were, in Israel of democratic politics, he is still for the two-state solution. He says he is. Number one, he's very close to Abu Mazen, the head of the Palestinian Authority, and it's a very safe place for him to be. Because just like it is for the American president, even if there's no chance of a Palestinian state, saying that that's what you want allows Heyman Chair's party to talk as if we're not completely threatening to change all of Israel. We're not going to mobilize all West Bank and Palestinian and Gaza Palestinians, even though in the long run, that's exactly what will happen. If you go down into the ranks of the groups that make up the joint list, you'll see that people really do not buy this. They don't believe it. They struggle over it. They have to keep repressing and preventing them from talking publicly about the one-state reality that they definitely believe is present. Recently, there have been arrests by the Palestinian Authority of dozens of people in the West Bank who tried to call for Israeli annexation, and they were arrested by the Palestinian Authority.
Thank you. The next question is, the issue is not a one-state reality, but whether a democratic binational state between the river and the sea is possible. How do you intend to persuade Israeli Jews to give up national self-determination? Is this not a harder task than getting them to accept a Palestinian state in part of Israel and Palestine?
So one of the things that goes along with my argument that you need to go through a deep change in thinking is not just the time frame and other things, but this. That question imagines that that there's Jews and there's Arabs. And the Jews have to be convinced because ultimately they decide there's a negotiations between them. Well, the Jews have much more differences among them than they have together with the Arabs. Okay? That's number one. Number two is you will never get negotiations between the Jews and the Arabs in which the Jews decide to give up something like the Jewish state. Take this as an example. When did white Christian Protestant Americans decide that the United States of America would be allowed to have a Catholic president, or maybe a black president, and maybe eventually a female and a Jewish president? When did the whites decide that? When did the Protestant whites decide it? Never. Because that's not how politics works. Kennedy was nominated in a very, in some dirty ways with money, with the usual politics of politics makes strange bedfellows. The Protestants of West Virginia were willing to go along with him because Joe Kennedy put a lot of money in there and because John Kennedy said some of the right things. It's a slow process, and whites, liberals, many of them, and union leaders saw, gee, we can get more out of allying with blacks on this issue than we can keeping them out of the political system. That's the kind of decision-making that counts. Over the long run, a multiracial democracy, a flawed one, emerged. It evolved in the United States. It was never decided upon as a plan by the whites who then gave up their Christian Protestant WASP ideal. The same thing, that is how political change of this magnitude takes place, not through negotiations of that sort. So there never will, in other words, gradually, Jews and Arabs will find themselves in situations where it doesn't pay to think that way, it pays to think other ways, and over time, they will wake up morning after morning and find actually they're not living in a white Protestant America anymore, they're living in a multiracial democracy. Lincoln never had that in mind, ever. He wanted the blacks to go back to Africa. He ran on an anti-miscegenation platform. But the unintended consequences of the North winning that war, multiracial democracy, about 120 years later.
So the next question is, there is a tremendous unequal power relations between the Israeli state and the Palestinians. You speak about long-term process. Well, why should the Palestinians wait? What actually do you propose with respect to make the Israeli government or the Israeli authorities move towards this sort of equality under the law? And so what should we do now, today, rather than in a long process of 100 years from now?
Well, because I never think that the Israeli current government is ever going to do what is right, you have to get them to do things that they think are in their short-term interest, but will have longer-term payoffs for me, for my progressive values. So I'd say, you want to annex? Aslan, annex, but I'm going to be watching the rights that Arabs get. So if you annex in this way, I'll recognize it, but not in that way. In other words, use the fact that they want to, they're going to bet, you have like people like Reuven Rivlin, the president. He said, literally, the only way we're going to keep all the land that's ours is really by giving equal rights to everybody, Arabs and Jews. That's Rivlin's position. And he means it for Gaza as well as the West Bank. Well, we should be holding any move toward annexation toward that standard. So that's one of the very concrete things that we should be doing right now. If you ask me, why should the Palestinians wait? No, they shouldn't wait. I would not say that blacks should have waited during Jim Crow. On the other hand, it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of help from the outside to struggle nonviolently, however you can effectively struggle. And one of the things that might mean that change can take place faster in the Israel-West Bank Palestinian domain than in the United States over the Jim Crow period is that we have video, we have instant video of everything that happens. We saw John Lewis clubbed on the bridge, but that wasn't until the 1950s. Now we have much more of that. That actually rapidly accelerated change. So I'm not saying the Palestinians should be waiting for anything. I'm not telling them, hold on, Israelis will come to their senses in 100 years. No, if they don't struggle, and if Jews in Israel don't struggle for allies wherever they can get them, and they will, that's what democracy does. It drives you to sleep with people you never thought you'd be sleeping with. And that's the only way that a non-Likud-based government is ever going to be established in Israel, is with Arab support. And one of the things I'm heartened by is how fast that has become apparent to so many people. So that now you have many peace now types who used to use the demographic argument ruthlessly, now have to keep quiet about it because they know they need the joint list. And that's a good thing. Those are all good things, and those are the things we should be focused on.
Do you think Gazans, the people of Gaza, would buy into a secular democratic state? The Gazans I speak to, says the speaker, would not support that. They imagine one state too, a Palestine based on the Islamic law.
Right. And you've got Jews that think of it as based on the Jewish law. I mean, what people think and what they're going to get as a result of doing things to try to get what they want are completely different. That's the meaning of man plans and God laughs. Lincoln didn't get what he wanted. No American who fought just about in the Civil War got what they wanted in the end. Let's look at the British case, because that's a fascinating one, and it may hold out hope for two-staters. Britain ruled Ireland as an occupying colonial power through the 18th century. It had already ruled it, it settled Ireland with Protestants, but in the 18th century, penal laws were enforced so that Catholics were reduced to almost serfdom. In 1800, the United Kingdom changed its name. It annexed Ireland and changed its name to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It still did not give equal citizenship or political rights to Catholics. In the 1830s, some Catholic bourgeois were given the right to vote. Not till the 1880s, with the general change in suffrage, did Catholics finally get the vote. Once the Irish Catholics got the vote, the liberals found that they couldn't form government without siding with the Catholics, but the Catholics wanted home rule for Ireland. That became the dominant issue. What we're going to do with Ireland in the 1880s, 1890s, in the pre-World War I decade. It tore British politics apart. There were those who said we have to give equality to Catholics fully, and then we have to get out of Ireland. Others said we have to rule it like India, and others said no, let's give them autonomy or a separate state. It took World War I and Intifada by the IRA in 1918 to 1921, and what happened? You got a two-state solution, basically on a loan plan. 3/4 of Ireland, with few Protestants in it, became independent, even though it wasn't supposed to be independent. So in that context, after 120 years of British democracy, of a binational Britain, you ended up with two states. It's still not done. There's still problems going on. And nothing was the result of anything that was intended by the people who annexed Ireland. They never imagined that the Irish would become powerful in British politics and then half of Ireland would secede. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to engage in, not to start with what people want now and therefore what they won't accept in the future, because what will happen in the future has nothing to do, or not much to do, with what people's preferences right now are. If you wanted to continue down that path, however, it is interesting to see that the proportions of Palestinians and Israelis who favor a one-state democratic solution is now about the same as the proportion that favored a two-state solution in the mid-1980s. So if you look it takes time for that to become a norm or a majority or a plurality opinion, but we're well on the way.
What do you think about the view that there is already an apartheid in the occupied territories?
I agree with it. What's different, what I'm focusing on is it's a silent apartheid. One of the reasons I, in a way, like Netanyahu, prefer Netanyahu to Gantz is that Gantz and many of the other folks who are associated with Commanders for Israel Security, when you read what they write, and I discuss this in detail in the book, you see that they do not really believe a two-state solution is attainable anymore. But they don't want to say that. They want to act as if it still is, because if they still treat it as our policy is to preserve the opportunity for negotiation, taking unilateral steps but not ruling it out, they don't have to face up to the fact of apartheid. They can keep Arabs out of Jewish life and have the Arabs bear the consequences of that, while still saying it's not because we think it's right, this is just temporary. But in fact, it's not temporary. They have no plan, absolutely zero idea of how to get from here to a negotiated two-state solution. You can read Susser's book, you can read my friend Gershon Shafir's book, Menachem Klein's book, you can read Yossi Elfer's book, or you can listen to Shaul Arieli. None of them have a plan or a scenario that they believe in or even want to tell you you should believe in for getting from here to a two-state solution. What they want is the pretense that that might happen so as not to have to engage Arabs in Israeli politics. Whereas I think that that's actually the road forward for those who have the values I have. And those values are equality, democracy, and mutually non-exclusive rights to self-determination.
Thank you so much, Ian. It was great. Thanks for the question. Thanks to all of you for participating, and have a good evening.
Let me just say one more thing. If
Yes,
anybody
of course.
engage me directly, send me an email, ilustick@sas.upenn.edu. And there's an ongoing opportunity to follow these issues at www.paradigmlostbook.com. Paradigmlostbook.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.